The world of Kabbalah. Tonight we begin the lesson one of the world of Kabbalah. The world of Kabbalah is a very interesting course. It's very exciting, and it's a buzzword. Kabbalah is something that many of us have mentioned, have discussed, have heard other people talk about. And really, the word Kabbalah conjures up many, many ideas, with everyone having different answers to the question, what does Kabbalah mean? What comes to mind when you hear the word Kabbalah? It means different things to different people. For some people, it invokes a sense of fascination, of intrigue, of interest. For other people, it's esoteric and complex nature, so they stick away from it. For others, yet, it brings about, and they associate Kabbalah with myth, with magic, with red strings, with all sorts of hangings in their homes, and so on and so forth. And some people link it to great seminars in certain places. And what does Kabbalah really mean? And so, just as we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, we certainly shouldn't judge a topic by people's assumptions. During this course, we will be opening books of Kabbalah to experience for ourselves what Kabbalah is really about. And during this course, we will gain answers to perhaps the biggest questions about Kabbalah. First off, the driving questions behind this course is, what is Kabbalah? What are Kabbalah's central teachings? What is the significance of some of its key terms, like Sefirot, or perhaps some other terms that you may be familiar with? And perhaps most importantly, how are these teachings relevant to my everyday life? And the reason I say perhaps this is the most important is because, yes, this course will enable us to understand and appreciate the mystical aspects. We also want to discover these deep concepts and how they are relevant to our personal lives. And this idea is perhaps best illustrated by a Hasidic story, which is related about the Rebbe Maharash, the fourth Chabad Rebbe, who lived in the mid-19th century. Rabbi Shmuel Schneerson was his name. And the Rebbe was once speaking with a follower of his, a Chassid, who was well-versed in Kabbalistic teachings, and especially the way they are explained and presented in Hasidic philosophy. And so the Rebbe was talking to him, and he said to him, so tell me, what do you do each morning before prayer? And the Chassid went ahead and explained, well, before prayer, I think about tremendous Kabbalistic concepts and Hasidic concepts that I've learned pertaining to the prayer. And after the prayer, what do you do? Asked the Rebbe. He says, well, after the prayer, I continue to meditate on these spiritual ideas. And the Rebbe continues his questioning, and he says, so what do you think about just before you say the Shema, which is said before retiring to bed? And once again, he tells the Rebbe, I meditate on these divine spiritual concepts. And the Chassid was expecting the Rebbe to commend him for his accomplishments, for his focus on spiritual concepts, on Kabbalistic ideas, and his meditation on it. And the Rebbe turns to him, and the Rebbe says, if you spend all your time thinking and meditating on God, when do you think about yourself? And upon hearing that, the Chassid fainted. This idea expresses really what Kabbalah is all about. The Chassid invested so much time and effort in understanding godliness, in appreciating the mysticism associated in speaking about Kabbalistic concepts. But what he forgot was that the goal of Jewish spirituality and mysticism is not the spiritual enlightenment or the mystical transcendence in and of themselves, but rather it is the idea that these concepts enable us to shift perspective and empower our growth. And so even the most abstract, mystical insight must affect our real life. And so that's why it's important that throughout discussion of Kabbalistic concepts, we have to make sure that we don't let our feet off the ground. Even as our minds and heart are soaring heavenward, we have to make sure that the definition of Jewish mysticism is understood, and that is that it's something for us to act upon. And it's not in and of itself. And this idea will be a guiding force throughout the entire course. That is the goal, really, of this course. We're going to start our journey by taking a quick glance into a couple of Kabbalistic works. If you open your student books, those who have it, if you have the PDF, those who didn't get their books yet, you will be getting it in the next week. Whoever signed up in the past week will be getting it in the next week, unless you live out of town, and that's just waiting for UPS or FedEx to deliver it. So if you have the textbooks, if you have the PDF, it's on page 4. If you look at page 4 and page 5, you'll see these interesting Kabbalistic diagrams. The first one is from the great sage Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who was a 16th sage, the Kabbalist who lived in the holy city of Tzifas in the Holy Land. And the second one on page 5 is another Kabbalah diagram from the great sage Rabbi Shabtai Sheftel Horowitz, who was also a late 16th, early 17th century Kabbalist. And he's known for many of his works. And in one of his works, he has this diagram. What are these diagrams about? Is that just to make us dizzy? Is that to sound esoteric when we discuss Kabbalistic concepts? So this way we can say there's nice pictures about Kabbalistic concepts. These diagrams are regularly found in the major Kabbalistic works. And apparently the Kabbalists were agreeing with the famous saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so the question is, what are these images about? What are they conveying? And we'll understand this and really understand what Kabbalah seeks to accomplish by turning to our character, the human character. Because yes, Kabbalah focuses a lot on God, but it also spends a great deal of time exploring you and me, exploring the human being. And that's because the human personality and character, the human soul, is really the optimal tool to understand Kabbalah. It's really the optimal tool to help us learn and appreciate important aspects of God and creation that may otherwise not be understood. And we'll see that in text 1 on page 6. We have a text from an early Kabbalist from the late 15th century, and the Kabbalist, he writes as follows, Rabbi Meir ibn Gabbai: a mortal is a mirror for supernal reality. All that exists in both higher and lower realms is present in microcosmic form within the human. This is the deeper significance of the Torah's statement that the human was created in the divine image. And this is why we say, from my flesh, I envision God. The human soul and character can teach us about God because the fact that we are created in the divine image. A child who comes from human parents will have a human personality. Similarly, a soul that comes from godliness will mirror godliness. And that's why Kabbalah turns to the human soul and the human character to find examples for some of its loftiest ideas. And therefore, we will repeatedly return to the Kabbalah's model of human character. Now, if you have the pullout, if you got the textbook, you'll notice that in the textbook, there is this Kabbalistic looking map. If you haven't gotten the textbook, I believe it's in the PDF as well. If it isn't, you will get your textbook and it will be in there. This map contains the hierarchy of the human character alongside a map of the hierarchy of the way God created the world, which we will get to in a moment. That's the two sides of the map. And really, that's what we're doing this entire course. We're going to go from the bottom up, explaining the hierarchy of the human character. And with that, we will explain the hierarchy of God's relationship to the world, which we will get to in a moment. See, Kabbalah explains that all different sections of the human character, they operate within this hierarchy, which, by way of an example, we will see how this hierarchy plays out when we purchase a home. We've all either purchased a home, redid our home, moved into our home. What was the driving force until we actually moved into that home? And once we reflect on this idea, we will see this hierarchy, where it started from and where it ends. The story begins with pleasure. The human soul derives deep pleasure from having a place to call home. This deep pleasure moves into and triggers a desire for a home. Once we have this desire for a home, we now move on to justify this endeavor logically, an intellectual process where we analytically study the ideas, what type of home we want, what aspects, financially, how can we afford it, all the logical all the logic associated with the purchase of a home. Finally, we go ahead, not finally, but we move on to explore all the details of this home that we want. Once we explore all the details, we rethink the entire plan. We speak it over with friends and family and consultants and advisors and various people who have to be involved, and we want their opinions. We look at the home. We come to all different types of decisions. And then finally, we have that final act where we sign, we have the handshake, we have the writing of the check, the transfer of funds. We finally did it. All these levels we will get to. We're going to analyze them. We will see all as these aspects within the human character. But what's relevant now is that similar to this process of buying a home, this idea, this human process helps us understand a heavenly hierarchical process, which is God's creation of the world. God's creation of the world seems simple in the opening verses of the Torah, right? The Torah begins, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Voila, there's the world, right? 6 days of creation, God created the world. But the reality is that between God's desire to create the world and the actual creation, the outcome that we know and experience on a day-to-day level, really is a multifaceted, sophisticated system with many different levels and stages. Let's have a look in text 2 on page 7. This is from the great sage Rabbi Meir ibn Gabbai, also a sage from the Holy Land, and he writes as follows: God fashioned a ladder planted on the earth whose top reaches into the heavens. This ladder's rungs serve as channels through which the flow of divine energy can devolve degree after degree in a constant pattern of progressive coarsening until the flow can be received at the lowest extreme of existence. What's Rabbi Moshe Alshich? Whenever we study a discipline, it's important to become familiar with its key language. And therefore, we will be, throughout this course, introducing various terms that perhaps you may not be familiar with, but they're right there in the textbook, and we will be explaining them as we go along in this course. This idea, this ladder that Rabbi Moshe Alshich is talking about, that enables this process, just as we have this human process that goes from that initial pleasure that we innately have to have a home. Following that, it leads into a desire to get a home. And then so on and so forth. We go through the thought process, the discussion process, and then the action. So too, God's creation of this world as we know it came from a multifaceted, sophisticated system from God's desire until it was created in this world. This term, or as the Alshich called it, the ladder, which comes from God's desire until this created world, in Kabbalah is called, look inside on page 7, the first key term is called seder hishtalshelut. And I'll be mentioning that term a number of times. Seder hishtalshelut. Seder hishtalshelut literally means a system of devolution. What does that mean? A chain means a shalshelet. That's how you say chain in Hebrew. The same root word is hishtalshelut, which is also a chain of events, so to speak, but it's a devolution. It's a descent. It's a chain that goes from a higher level to a lower level. And if you have that map, that's really what is on this map. And that is what is in many of those Kabbalistic diagrams and picture is what's called the seder hishtalshelut, the order of devolution. Now, we're not going to understand all the details of the devolution, but suffice it to say that this idea, the seder hishtalshelut, is what Kabbalah discusses by and large. It's understanding this order of devolution from God's desire until the creation of the physical world. And this is going to be what will direct our framework for the next 6 weeks, understanding this order of devolution, which really answers one of the questions, begins to answer one of the questions we mentioned in the beginning. What were the questions that we asked? We said, what is Kabbalah? What is its central teachings? Kabbalah is largely about a sophisticated exploration of the order of devolution. It's to understand how it operates. And just as a computer scientist studies the inner workings of a computer and a biologist examines the human genome, so too Kabbalah understands and searches to understand and explore this order of devolution. And that explains the diagrams we saw earlier. The diagrams we saw earlier were intended to help aspiring Kabbalists to understand the hierarchy in what is, by definition, a real esoteric and complex concept. So that is the what of Kabbalah. What is Kabbalah? It's understanding and exploring the order of devolution, how it went from God's desire to the creation of this world. And that may sound a little gibberish, but we'll get to that. That's what we have 6 weeks for. Now, another point of introduction to the entire concept of Kabbalah is the how of Kabbalah. And this is perhaps my favorite slide. It's how did Amelia Bedelia land in Kabbalah? So we'll get to that. What's the how of Kabbalah? Let's look in text 3 on page 8. The saintly Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov taught that when studying works of Kabbalah, we must be careful not to perceive the Kabbalistic ideas as literal physical concepts. Because seder hishtalshelut, this order of devolution, consists of non-material realities. It's crucial that we avoid thinking of them as materialistic concepts, like Amelia Bedelia, right? When you say, put the lights out, it doesn't mean literally put the lights out as she did. It means turn the lights off, right? It's not something materialistic. And this point is highlighted, and we will highlight it throughout the course a number of times, the idea that we're talking about something spiritual, which is really when we talk about things higher and lower. For example, when you're talking about a company, who's greater in the company? Who is higher in the company? You're not talking about who sits on a higher floor in the building. You're not talking about who has taller shoes or who is taller 6'5", 6'3". When you're talking about who's higher in the company, you're talking about a position level. It's something which is more spiritual. It's something metaphysical. We're not talking about something materialistic. So too, when we talk about seder, hishtalshelut, we will be talking about throughout the next 6 weeks, this order of devolution, we're talking about spiritual reality. So higher and lower is spiritual altitudes, not physical altitude. And so we get closer to these realities by going not on a physical journey, but rather going on a mental, spiritual journey, which is really what this course will enable. Which leads us to the why. Why is the study and exploration of the order of devolution of seder, hishtalshelut, and of Kabbalah in general important? So, on one level, it's theological. To learn about God, learn about God's ways. To learn how God created the world, to learn what is the backstory. But it's more important than that. The Kabbalists show that many aspects of this world are better understood once we know this devolving chain, once we know the seder, hishtalshelut, because this background information enables us to make better choices in life. Because if you know the background, the back end of a computer system, you're better able to navigate the system. You're better able to understand the why, the how, the ups, the downs, and it'll inform your decision on moving forward. If you understand the background of anything, it gives you a better understanding to work more effectively and to work with more vigor. This applies, and perhaps even more so when we're seeking to understand ourselves and what makes us tick. Because when we study seder hishtalshelut, as we explained, we are created in the image of the seder hishtalshelut. This order of devolution is on the macro, the understanding of how God created the world and the spiritual realms, but it's mirrored, as we mentioned in the beginning, in ourselves. And so the more we appreciate up there, the more we appreciate the backstory, the more we appreciate the seder hishtalshelut, the order of devolution, the better we will live down here. And these concepts will become clearer to us as we move through this course. The three concepts we will focus on tonight is Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. These sounds like great names for people who practice yoga, perhaps the names of their children. What are these three names which sound gibberish to us? These three names are names of three spiritual worlds. The names of these three spiritual worlds are not just random names, they're actual borrowed terms from the narrative of creation. Where during the narrative of creation, we are told a number of times that God created, God fashioned, and God made the physical world. Accordingly, these three realms, these three spiritual worlds, are named with these three ideas taken from the creation story. The first one is Bria. Bria is taken from bara, creation. Second one is Yetzira, taken from, it is the noun from the verb yatzar, fashioned. And Asiya is taken from the verb asa, made. And then on the bottom, we have the physical Asiya, which is what Kabbalah calls our world. The world we are currently in, the physical world we are in. And as we'll see soon, these correspond in the microcosm to the human traits of thought, speech, and action. We'll get to that in a moment. These are many concepts, but I promise we're going to tie them all together. To easily refer to these three, Kabbalah has an acronym, right? It's not just the United States Department of State or Department of Defense that likes using acronyms for everything. It's also Kabbalah. There's many acronyms in Kabbalah. This is one of them. Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, these three spiritual worlds are referred to by the acronym of Bia. B-Y-A, Bia. It's right there in your book, page 10, which is literally just an acronym of the three words: created, shaped, and made. What are these three words? What does it mean? Why were they created? Why do they exist? What happens in them? What does it mean, practically speaking? And so we'll glean the answer from going back to the very beginning and asking, why? What did creation accomplish? What did creation accomplish? When God created the world, what did creation accomplish? On a very basic level, the most basic level, creation introduced physical matter into existence. Before God created the world, there was no dust particles, there were no flowers, there was no tables, there was nothing. And then creation came along, and now we find these in abundance. That's on a very basic level. But creation also introduced a second shift. Before creation, there was one identity. There was one existence. It was just God. Before creation, God was everything, and everything was God. There was no everything. There was nothing else aside from God. Once creation came about, there introduced a new concept. God introduced a new concept, a concept of something that can feel independent from God. Now, I say something that can feel independent from God because ultimately everything is still God. Ultimately, everything is still the divine. Ultimately, everything is still godliness. But from our perception, we see ourselves as independents. We see this bookshelf behind me as an independent structure. It has nothing to do with God. It's independent. This idea, this shift, this new possibility of existence was something that came about with the creation of the world. A being that bears a self-concept. It may be the loftiest self-concept, a soul, an angel, or something very, very materialistic and mundane, like a table and a bookshelf and a computer. But this existence, this idea, this concept of something which bears a self-concept was non-existence before creation. Creation introduced it. In Kabbalistic terms, here's a new term, that is called yeshut, a yesh. Right? In Hebrew, how do you say something is? You say yesh, it is, there is. Right? To be or not to be, it is. So this concept in Kabbalah means, yeshut means literally existence. Existence with a sense of self-awareness and independence. Then that is something that creation introduced. Now, to go from no existence, from something not having any existence, from it only being God and nothing outside of God, to God creating something materialistic, something not even materialistic, even spiritual, but an aspect that can have an existence with a sense of self-awareness and independence, didn't happen overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day. So Yeshua did not emerge in one swoop. And that's where we come to these three worlds. These three worlds exist because there was a three-part process in the transition from an exclusive God identity to a fully realized Yeshut, a fully realized existence with a self-awareness and independence. This idea of a three-part transformation in order to come about and develop a new existence is something which is very common. And we'll use the example of There we go. We'll use the example of a human being, right? There's a famous story. They say there's a famous debate, and I'm not talking about from a Jewish legal perspective. There's a famous debate, right? When is a child a child? When is a human being the real existence? Is it from conception? Is it from birth? And Jewish mothers like to say that real existence is only once their child graduates medical school. So when things begin to develop, when a person begins to develop, there are three stages. There's the embryo stage, where there's very little observable shape, character, but it's there, it's in existence. Following the embryo comes the fetus. It's starting to get that outline of a body. It has some sort of shapes and lines, and you can figure it out. And eventually, just before the baby is born, it reaches full physical maturity. In a similar way, when Yeshus first emerged, when this existence, when something that can feel that it is an existence outside of God and it is self-aware and independent, it also emerged in these three levels. First, it came the world of Bria, where this possibility of something that's mildly there outside of godliness. Then it transitioned into a more defined Yeshus in the world of Yetzirah. And finally, it became a full-blown independent identity in the world of Asiya. So in order for creation, the entirety of creation, to come into the world as we perceive it today, it needed to go through this three-level process. This is the lowest level of the world of devaluation. And it's really in the names of the worlds themselves, of these realms, of these spiritual stages themselves. The Hebrew word that is the root of the first realm is bara, bria. Bara means created. What happens in the world of bara? It refers to the creation of something from nothing, which is very different to the formation of something that is already existing. If you take a tree and you break it apart and move it into a table, you didn't create anything. You just refashioned something that was already in existence. Creating is taking something from nothing, is creating something from nothing. In other words, what does bara capture? Bara includes that moment from 0 to 1. Before there was no identity other than God, now there's something else. Like the embryo, there's something else. It doesn't have a shape, it doesn't have anything, there's nothing in existence yet, really, but it's the first start. It's that first moment, it's from 0 to 1. Bara also means outside. In other words, what are we talking about here? It's the first level where there's an existence in its perception which is outside of God, something else aside from God. Referring to the fact that Bria, this world of Bria, the world of creation, is the first existence which is outside of God. Following the world of creation, it devolved into the world of shaping, the world of Yetzirah. Why? Because what's Yetzirah? Yetzirah gives shape to a pre-existing entity. That entity started in Bria, in Bara, in the world of creation, and now it is giving shape to a pre-existing entity. That's what Yetzira means. That's what the Hebrew word Yetzira means. It means to give shape to a pre-existing entity, which is literally what is happening in that world, in that realm. Finally, we have the third term, which is the world of Asiya, which means to make, to complete a task. Asa means to complete a task. And that's really what happens in the world, like as we explained in the metaphor, utilizing the fetus, the embryo, the fetus, and then the fully formed child ready to be born. Right now, that child is completed. It's just missing that final step when it's actually born. So too in the world of Asiya, the spiritual world of Asiya, that existence, which is now outside or perceives itself as outside of the divine, outside of godliness, it's no longer itself. It's no longer God. It's now its own independent creation. It now feels entirely independent. It has a self-awareness, and it's ready to be born. It's ready to move on to create this world which we are in. This is the how, the actual steps. And now we're going to move into the why, which will give us better understanding of these three terms. And we will use a metaphor that will help us understand and start bringing this Kabbalistic concept into something that we can relate to more. Why does this creation of the world, the yesh, have to go through three stages in its development? Right? When God created the world, something from nothing, God could have just created the world. And now there's something outside of God. It had to go through these three stages. Because something which is outside of God, but it is so close to God, it may be in existence in and of itself, but it's so close to the overbearing and over powerful divine that it's entirely subsumed within the divine. For the world to be created by God, God needed to separate that existence with multiple levels of separation, or as we see here, 3 levels of separation, in order for the existence to feel entirely independent of God and not be close and overwhelmed by God's existence. And so the closer something is to God, the more overwhelmed it is by God's existence and entirely subsumed within God's existence. The more distant it is, the less subsumed it feels, and the more of a independent creation it can become. Let's have a look in text 5, page 12. There are 3 rungs: Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Bria is the first introduction of Yeshut, an independent self-concept. However, existence only develops into a complete Yesh when it reaches the 3rd stage. Existence can only be a complete entity when it reaches the 3rd stage. Why? The reason Yeshut develops gradually is because the initial stage of existence remains close to God, and his presence is very much sensed at this level. Then Bria devolves into Yetzira, the 2nd world, where the presence of God is somewhat concealed. Finally, Yetzira devolves into Asiya, where God is completely concealed. At this point, existence becomes a true Yesh and gains a complete sense of selfhood. Let's consider 3 teenagers. There's Sarah, there's Rachel, and there's Rebecca. Sarah is mature enough to realize that she's an independent person who's not synonymous with her parents. She's not. She realizes that. But her independent character and her self-concept are barely developed. She says, I'm not my parents. But it's difficult for her and others to describe who she is. Her sense of independence is subdued. Then there's Rachel. Rachel is more adult-like. She can clearly express who she is, down to the finest detail. She's well equipped to recognize how she's different from her parents, different from her friends, what she brings to the table. She has a real self-concept that has come into full bloom, and her separation from her parents' identity is complete. And then there's Rebecca. Rebecca is somewhere in between. She's somewhere in between Sarah and Rachel in terms of her maturity, her self-concept, her independence from her parents. Why does this happen? They're all three teenagers. It happens, or perhaps one of the reasons it can happen, is because of the parents' relative proximity or distance to their children. Sarah, this 14-year-old who knows that she's not her parents, but it's kind of hard for her to describe who she is, what she is, her self-concept. Her parents were run-of-the-mill helicopter parents, extremely protective, assertive over her choices, telling her what to do, telling her what to think, telling her how to think. They were present in every single decision of her life. They didn't let her make decisions for herself, and so she is subsumed by their characters. Their identities, their lifestyles shine through into Sarah's every move. They didn't provide any space for Sarah to figure out who she really is. On the other extreme, Rachel's parents, they gave her complete independence, which gave her the opportunity to learn about her own preferences, her own personality, who she is, her real self-concept. She's entirely independent of her parents. And Rebecca's parents are somewhere in between. And so, in short, the self-concept of the three teenagers really depends on the presence or lack thereof of their parents. Something similar occurs with these three worlds. Although God's creative force must always be present in every existence, there is a difference in how it's executed. The first stage of existence, the first stage of Yeshus, which we called Bria, that realm of Bria, that spiritual level of Bria, is the first recipient of God's creative energy. And as such, that first level senses God acutely. It's entirely subsumed within God's presence, like Sarah and her parents. And so it's Yeshus, it's there, but it's stunted. It's entirely covered over. It has a self-concept, but it doesn't feel it entirely. It senses something which is much greater, much more compelling than its own self-concept, which is something which is overpowerful. It's enduring, it's fascinating, it's large, it's overbearing, and it's there, and it overwhelms it. And it wants to become part of it. It wants to be one with it. It wants to force its own sense of self to nothingness. This level of this feeling of nothingness, although having a self-concept but feels nothingness, is spoken about in Kabbalah, this being subsumed entirely by dint of its proximity to the divine. It's called bittul. Page 13. Bittul. That's in the world of Bria. The existence, which although it does begin to have a certain sense of self-concept, it's entirely subsumed in the divine because it feels its power acutely. Not so in the subsequent two divine realms, Yetzira and Asiya. Let's get back to our analogy. When we come to Rebecca and Rachel, because their parents aren't hovering over their every decision, they're not those helicopter parents, this allows them to sense themselves, at least somewhat by Rebecca, by Yetzira, and more so by Rachel, even more so by Asiya, which is why it develops into a complete existence that has a self-concept, a feeling of independence, of an entire separation. Once existence goes through these three levels, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, now it travels through that devolution that went from the divine, was created, that initial sense, but was still entirely subsumed with the divine, moved on to the world of Yetzira, of being formed and gaining a greater sense of existence and self-concept, until it finally moved on to Asiya, the world where it became a completed task made. The world of Asiya, it was made into something complete and now is entirely independent. Now it's ready to move on and become the physical world, which we are in right now. That's the devolution, to go from the divine until the physical world, to take something entirely spiritual and move it into something physical. And just to give another example, or an example for this concept, take, for example, Niagara Falls. Right? There's a big area around Niagara Falls that gets energy from the falls. But in order for the falls to give electricity to a home, to a light bulb, there's an entire series of devolution that enables it to give it. Because if it just went straight from the falls into the light bulb, you'd have a problem. It's way too much energy for a single light bulb. Which is why there's an entire plant right there at the falls that's taking from that energy. There's a dam system. There's a at the bottom of the river, I forget what it's called, right? And there's an entire system that slowly but surely devolves that energy until it becomes energy that's manageable, that's workable, to be able to transfer and put it into the piping and put it into the wiring and put it into the light bulb in your home. So too, this spiritual energy of the divine, it's so powerful and so overbearing. It would be impossible for something so powerfully spiritual to go ahead and create a physical world which is devoid of spirituality. Right? We look around the world around us, we don't see spirituality. In order to go from something so great to something so lowly, so to speak, it had to go through this devolution from the world of Bria onto Yetzira, onto Asiya, until finally in the physical world. Which really gets us thinking that perhaps it's pretty hard to get involved in spirituality in this physical world, to exercise our spiritual muscles, because we live in a world devoid of spirituality. But the reality is that we are able to rise above the materialistic nature of existence and to really achieve moments of spiritual clarity. We have those moments in our day when we are focused on our own aspirations, when God feels entirely distant from us. We're living in an Asiya reality, as if we're a finished product entirely disassociated from God. When we sense God's presence, at that time we are living in a Yetzira reality, one which is in that kind of middle level. But at the moments when we're living in a semblance of a Bria reality is when we're entirely overwhelmed by God's presence. So these worlds isn't just a Kabbalistic concept which is entirely out there. They're also states of mind that we can achieve. This is the first level or the lowest level of seder hishtalshelut, the order of devolution. Now, in order for us to kind of tie this idea together before we move on to the more practical side of it, which will really tie it together and will connect with it on a very practical level, there's a short clip here that I'll show you that'll hopefully give us a better understanding on the Kabbalistic, this dry, complex side to it, before we move on to the second half of these concepts. So bear with me just a moment as I will pull it up.
What is the Kabbalah? It's Judaism's mystical wisdom. It discusses souls, the deeper meaning of things, and the spiritual system of the heavens. Never heard of this heavenly system? That's okay. Why don't we do what Kabbalah does best? Offer a parable to explain something abstract. You decide to build a home. Your plan actually begins with an intuition of pleasure. Deep within your subconscious, you sense the enormous pleasure of dwelling in a home that truly suits you. That spark of pleasure that invades your brain's desire center. I want a home, you tell yourself. Immediately, your intellect grabs the wheel. You logically justify your desire and analyze the possibilities. Your emotions chime in. How do I feel about this location? Am I comfortable with high windows? You carefully rethink your plan, you discuss it with friends, and are finally ready for action. Sign, build, move. What's all that got to do with heaven? The Kabbalah reveals that when God decided to create the physical world, God first created an entire spiritual system that parallels the experience we've just described. In this first video, we'll take a quick look at the final three stages of this system. In each subsequent video, we will climb one level higher as we explore this supernal chain of command. The mystical work titled The Zohar discusses the existence of three spiritual worlds that precede our own. Their names are Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiya. These worlds are inhabited by angels and souls, souls before they descend to earth, and those who have passed away and flourish in the afterlife. In Hebrew, the word Beriah means to create something from nothing at all. So in the spiritual world of Beriah, for the first time in the entire system, things exist that are aware of their own existence. They feel independent, outside of God. That's amazing, because nothing is independent of God. But in Beriah, God hides His presence to enable entities to emerge with a sense of self. Nevertheless, the angels and souls that inhabit Beriah feel tremendously close to God and are completely focused on God. Everything here is fragile, extremely close to losing its identity and being blissfully overwhelmed by proximity to God. So, God took it one step further and created the spiritual world of Yetzirah, which means to give shape to something. This is where the sense of independence from God truly begins to take shape. Here, God hides His presence to a far greater degree, which allows the spiritual inhabitants of Yetzirah to develop greater self-awareness. That said, God is still sensed in the spiritual place. And so, God made Asiya, which in Hebrew implies a complete and final product. From its perspective, the sense of independence from God is complete. Asiya has two linked layers. Its top layer consists of spiritual beings, and in its lower layer is our physical universe, the tangible, material world we know so well, where we struggle to relate to the divine force that continuously creates us. The good news? Even as we reside in the physical Asiya, our souls keep a connection with those higher worlds from which they emanate. The spiritual Asiya helps us peer beyond the physical. Yetzirah empowers us to suspend our self-focus long enough to sense God's presence. And Beriah helps us feel blissfully overwhelmed by God's presence, at least momentarily, such as in a moment of meditative prayer. So, we walk planet Earth, but at the same time, we can be firmly rooted in the bliss of spiritual loftiness.
All right. So what we had here was an overview of the first half of the class, the Kabbalistic side of the class, and that's why we will deepen our understanding of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya by identifying and discussing the Bria-like, not the Bria, the Bia-like realities in our own character, which are thought, speech, and action. We all have thought, speech, and action. And in order for us to understand the relationship between these behaviors and Bia, Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya, we need to establish that these three, thought, speech, and action, are merely behaviors. And that's a key point. They are not synonymous with you, with your soul. They're separate entities. They have a separate identity, your thought, your speech, and your action. And here's a small exercise. If you have a pen handy, then use it. If not, it's all right, but you'll get the idea. Write down 2 + 2 = 5, and I love moldy tofu. Write it down on a piece of paper. Now say it to yourself. Hopefully no one's around so they don't think you're talking to yourself. Say it to yourself, 2 + 2 = 5. I love moldy tofu. Think it. Think 2 + 2 is 5. Think I love moldy tofu. Right? All doable. Hopefully everyone was able to complete those tasks. Now, in your mind, please understand that 2 + 2 = 5. Understand it. And feel attracted, feel a desire to moldy tofu. My guess is no one succeeded in understanding that 2 + 2 is 5, and no one succeeded in really loving moldy tofu. Why? Because when it comes to thinking, to speaking, and to acting, they're behaviors that are outside of ourselves. They're not synonymous with who you are. Your intellect, your desire is who you are. They're expressions of yourself. But your thought, your speech, your action are the behaviors of yourself. They're not who you are. The soul itself consists of the content and style of your intellect, your intelligence, and your emotions. and intelligence and emotions we're going to discuss in lesson 2. In your soul, in your intelligence, in your emotions, there's no place for 2 + 2 = 5. There's no place for eating moldy tofu because you don't like moldy tofu, and nothing you say, do, or think will make you like moldy tofu or understand 2 + 2 = 5. Your soul can't be attracted to something you genuinely dislike. But action, speech, and even thought are outside of your soul, which is why we can operate them in ways that contradict our soul. This external nature of these behaviors also is expressed in their duration when it comes to the essence of yourself, of who you are. It's nearly impossible to change who you are. Sometimes it's literally impossible to change who you are. But your thoughts, your speech, and your action is not you, which is why they're easily changeable. I can speak, I can stop speaking. I can act, I can stop acting. Now, I can't stop thinking. Thinking is constant, but I can quickly change what I'm thinking about. Which is why these 3 behaviors are separated from, this is not why, this underscores how they are separated from the soul. The self and these 3 behaviors are separated, which is why Kabbalah refers to these as garments, as levushim, as garments. They're garments to the soul, just as clothing. You can put them on, you can take them off. Monday morning, you put on one pair of clothing. You don't like it. Monday afternoon, you switch into a different pair. Monday evening, you're going out to a wedding. You switch on your evening clothing, right? It's not who you are. It's something outside of you. And so the soul uses the garment of thought to make a person conscious of your mind, of your emotions. The soul uses the garment of speech to communicate one's mind and emotions out to something outside of it. And the soul uses the garment of action to impose its will on physical things. But they're just garments. They do not have this inherent connection with the self. They have their own identity. These are called levushim, garments, or levushe hanefesh, garments of the soul, because they're just like garments. You can put them on, you can take them off. That brings to mind the story. This guy comes to the tailor and says, "Can you please make for me a pair of pants?" And the tailor goes ahead and he spends a week and he's making this pair of pants. And Jack comes back to the tailor and says, "Where's my pants?" He says, "Oh, I'm not ready yet." 2 weeks go by, a month goes by. Jack comes back to the tailor and says, "Where's my pants?" He says, "I'm sorry, the pants are not ready yet. I'm still working on them." After 3 months, finally, Jack comes to the tailor, and the tailor says they're still not ready. And Jack says, "I don't understand. God created heaven and earth in 6 days, and in 3 months, my pants are not ready." And the tailor says, "Look at the world, and now you'll see the pants, and you'll see why it takes 3 months." Garments are something that's easily changeable. Garments have their own identity, and they are not synonymous with the soul. Now we can appreciate why we say that there's a relationship between thought, speech, and action and the world of Asiya, Bria, and Yitzira. And we'll see how the relationship between our garments of thought, speech, and action and our soul, ourself, how that corresponds to the relationship between Biyah and Hashem. See, we already know that what is Biyah, Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, these 3 realms, they are yeshus, they are forms of existence that have their own identity separate from God's identity, right? That's exactly what our levushim are, what our garments of thought, speech, and action are. They have their own identity and remain separate from the soul themselves. Right? Have a look in text 6a on page 15. Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya are comparable to physical garments. We can always remove our garments and dress in alternative garments because garments are not part of our essential selves. In the soul's experience, this correlates to thought, speech, and action, which are not relevant to the core of the soul, but serve only as its garments. And it's not just a collective association and comparison between Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, and thought, speech, and action, there's an actual correlation and correspondence one for one of these three. There's thought, there's speech, and there's action. Thought correlates and corresponds to Bria, speech corresponds to Yetzira, and action corresponds to Asiya. How is that? When you think of something, right? Your thought, if you think about, let's do an exercise. Think about a loved one. No, child, a parent, a spouse, a loved one. Now that you think about that loved one, if you were asked to speak about the nature of that love to this person, how would you describe it? And finally, if you were asked to act out, to gesture that relationship to this person that you love, how would you do that? When were you able to feel more of your love? Through your thinking about that love, through your speaking about it, or through your actions trying to convey it about another person? I'm not talking about actions of giving a hug or a kiss or anything like that. I'm talking about actions explaining it to someone else through action, through speech, or thinking it to yourself. We generally assume that our thoughts are able to house the intensity of our love in ways that words can't describe. Certain feelings we can't describe, right? Certain emotions can be expressed in thought, but there's no way we can't find expression in words. What does that indicate? That the garment of the thought is much closer to the soul than speech and action. Because it's closer, that's why the power of thought is, it feels the souls more forcefully. It's constantly churning within us, and it remains unknowable to others. Because it's subsumed within our thought. It's a garment. We can switch our thought process, but it's still subsumed within our soul. It's connected. It feels attached to our soul. That's like Bria to God. It's on the outside of God, but it's so close to God that it's almost undiscernible as something outside of God. Then we move on to speech. Speech doesn't run constantly. By some people it does, but speech doesn't run constantly. Times when a person can speak, there's times when a person is quiet. It's observed by other people. They only exist, speech only exists as an outward expression. But there's still no separation between the words and the speaker. You can have words that exist without the speaker speaking them. So it's kind of in between. On the one hand, it's more distant from us. Speech is more distant from us. It's on the outside of us. But on the other hand, it's still connected to us somewhat. Right? It's also not tangible. That's like the world of Yetzirah as it relates to God, where it's slowly getting more of a form outside of God as an independent existence, but it's still somewhat connected to God. Until finally we reach to action. The words that I write, furniture that I build, something that I do, exists outside of me. And not only exists outside of me, unless I announce it to the world, no one knows that I'm the one that wrote those words. No one knows that I'm the one that built that building. It doesn't show that I'm the one that did it. My action is something physical, something tangible, which is foreign to the spiritual world. That is like the world of Asiya. Where we're reaching a predominant sense of separation and independence. what exactly happens in the world of Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya, where, as I mentioned, where the angels are, where the souls are. That's in the textbooks on page 18, page 19, page 20, and that you'll read throughout the week. But this brings us to the final point, and we're going to go a little bit over time, and please excuse me for that. Because of the introductory points, hopefully in the coming lessons we won't go over time. All right. Which brings us to the final step, and that is, how is Biyah, Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya, thought, speech, action, how is this idea and this mental exercise relevant how we live our lives? Right? They say the joke of a Jewish mother who was sent home from jury duty because she insisted that she's guilty. Right? We often struggle over our tendencies, our character traits, our flaws. Sometimes we have a tendency to be too frivolous about matters important to us. Sometimes we're too harsh on ourselves, like the Jewish mother. Even if we don't define ourselves by these flaws, there's still realities that plague our lives and cause us stress. Learning about Biyah, what it does is, it teaches us that our character flaws is outside of our identity. It's outside, just as Biyah, its perception is that it's outside of God's identity. And this is the novelty of Biyah over higher realms that we'll get to in subsequent weeks, which are entirely subsumed within God, is that our thought, speech, and action are called garments because they stand outside our identity. Once we know that they're outside of our identity, we know that the disposition of our internal character does not automatically dictate what happens in the realms of our garments. Even if my natural tendency leans towards arrogance, I can still act modestly. Even if my character is more cynical, I can still speak favorably of others. Even if my inclination is to be anxious, I can still think calming thoughts because we are in control of our garments. We may not be in control of our personality. We may not be in control of our character. We may not be in control of our essence, but we're in control of our garments that we can switch at the flip of a finger, at the snap of a finger. We can change what we think about. We can change what we talk about. We can change what we do. And just because there's a bruise on my body does not mean that I have to wear a shirt with a red stain on it. Just because I have an inclination towards arrogance doesn't mean I have to act arrogantly. Sometimes we feel like we're compelled to act in a certain way or say specific words because this is how I feel and this is who I am, right? We say that those are people who don't have a filter. Yeah, they say if there are 10 birds on a wire, and 9 of the birds decide to fly away, how many birds are left? 10, because deciding to fly away doesn't mean that they actually flew away. So it's a slightly different point, but it's the same idea where one doesn't automatically translate into the other. It's common for people to think that they are what they think about, but as we just demonstrated, this isn't true. With effort and with perhaps slightly effort, we can remove our thoughts from one subject and put them into a different subject. We can switch them, we can move them. In text 7, page 23, thought, speech, and action are merely garments to the soul. Just as we are able to remove the body's garments, so we can remove the soul's garments of speech and action by refraining from speaking or acting. And just as we can exchange one article of clothing for another, so can we switch our thought, which constantly runs from one subject to another. This is in contrast to the intellect and emotion that, as part of the actual soul, demand much effort to effectively change. And that's why these 3 garments of thought, speech, and action are hinted to in the word Adam. Not Adam, A-T-O-M, Adam, A-D-A-M, Adam. The first person is called Adam. Adam Arishon, Adam, the first person. In Hebrew, the word Adam, the word man, mensch, person, A real mensch. What's a mensch? Is Adam. Aleph stands for the word alefcha, which means thought. Dalet, the D in Adam, stands for dibur, which means speech. And mem, the M in Adam, stands for maisa, which means action. What makes a person a real mensch? What determines a person if they're a real mensch? Not their essence, what they're naturally predisposed to. What defines a person, what determines if a person is a real mensch, is a real Adam, is a real Adam, is their thought, their speech, and their action. You can live how you want. This is what Biyah teaches us. Biyah doesn't sense itself as a part of godliness, and correspondingly, your levushim, your garments, don't sense themselves as part of your personality. And so they don't need to take a cue from your personality. You are empowered to live the way you want to. And there's a story related in by the sages. I'm not going to read it inside, just to save a little time. To give you an overview, there was a sage who sent a drawing of his face to a physiognomist. Physiognomist is, I did not know what a physiognomist is. It's a master who discerns temperament and character from one's outward appearance, right? As people like look at handwriting. So he looks at it from the people's outward appearance. So this great sage sends a painting of himself with a student of his to this great physiognomist. The guy looks at it and he says, I don't want to look at this picture. He puts the picture away. He says, why don't you want to look at the picture? He says, oh, this picture of this person, this is a terrible person. This is a person, this face that I'm blocking. I see in it coveting, I see in it adultery, I see in it robbery. I can't gaze on the face of such evil. The student is petrified. I mean, this is the picture of his master, of his teacher. And he's afraid to go back, but he brings it back to his teacher at the urging of his teacher. And his teacher says, you know what? This physiognomist is a master at what he does. He outshines all the others because everything he said is true, because my internal inclination drives me and seduces me to commit all of that. But my wisdom I use to refrain from acting upon. And this idea that the sages relate the story is that the garments are ours to control. That's what it teaches us. The garments we can control. We cannot control, or it's much harder, nearly impossible to control our essence, but we can control our garments, which teaches us this idea, this general concept of thought, speech, and action, and the hierarchy of it, gives us an interesting idea that in life, we have this hierarchy in everything in life. There are times when we need to make important decisions in life. Changing jobs, strengthening our Judaism, relocating, picking a specific school. And there's many smaller decisions on a daily basis that we make in our relationships, in our career, in our mission in life. There are three crucial steps involved in making these decisions. First, we need to think, strategize, and plan, thought. Then we need to consult with friends, experts, and mentors, which is speech. And finally, implement the decision into reality. Some of us struggle with one over the other. Some of us may struggle with both of them. Some of us may be better at action, but we never think or like talking to people about it. Some of us are better at thinking about things, but we never discuss it with other people. We definitely don't bring it into action. And maybe in different areas of life, we're stronger at different aspects of decision. What Biyah teaches us, Kabbalah tells us, is that we need all three. Bria is a wonderful world. It excels at spiritual sensitivity, but God also created the other two worlds of Yetzirah and Asiya. Asiya is a great world. It brings it into action, but God also created the first two worlds. We cannot skip and go straight to action, and we cannot stay stuck in thought. What Biyah teaches us is that we have to make sure to order our garments. We have to make sure that in our decisions in life, we don't get stuck in thought, but we make sure that we have thought. We need to have all three, and in that order. We need to have thought, speech, and action. which leads us also into the various forms of mitzvahs, of commandments that we have. There are some commandments that are actionable commandments, giving charity, for example, putting on tefillin. There are some commandments which are speech and thought, studying Torah, prayer, love of God, etc. And within each mitzvah, there's the thought, speech, and action. There's thinking about the feeling of what we're accomplishing by doing this mitzvah. There's the blessing of the mitzvah, and then there's the act of the mitzvah. Just as it is in life that we always have to have all three. We have to make sure our thought is there, and it leads into speech by consulting others. And then making sure that it leads into action, so too by mitzvahs. Biyah is important. All three are very important. All three behaviors need to be unleashed properly to achieve proper spiritual connection. We need to do all three actions of the mitzvah, because that's how we have that proper hierarchy to achieve proper spiritual connection. And finally, whether we want to better our garments, our levushim, spiritually or practically, the task can often be difficult, which is why we begin each day with certain exercises, stretches, to exercise our personal biyah, our personal thought, speech, and action. The Jewish calendar, the Jewish to-do list of our morning, the way the Torah tells us, the Code of Jewish Law, incorporates within it this hierarchy of first thought, then speech, then action. And we'll look in the final text on page 30, text 10, and we'll conclude with this idea. The Code of Jewish Law says as follows: as soon as we wake up, we should contemplate before whom we are lying and become aware that the King of Kings is close at hand. As it is stated, the entire earth is filled with his glory. And then it continues. It is best to habituate ourselves immediately upon waking to recite Moda'ani, I thank you, living and eternal King, for you have mercifully restored my soul within me. Great is your faithfulness. This will remind us of God's intimate presence and inspire us to rise energetically. Seeing that the Moda'ani does not include a divine name, we are permitted to recite it before ritually washing our hands. Before we even begin to implement our mission for our day, we have to prepare ourselves. And as this text just showed us, we prepare ourselves through first contemplating God's relevance in our lives as soon as we open our eyes in the morning. Then we move on to speech, to reciting the Moda'ani that Jews have recited from the beginning of time. Every single morning we recite the Moda'ani, verbalizing our gratitude for the gift of another day, which is Yitzirah. And finally, immediately following speech, we move into action, we move into Bria, Asiya. We wash our hands just as the priest did when preparing to serve in the Holy Temple as a form of purification. So too, we're getting ready for our days of divine service, because everything we do is really a divine service by washing our hands, which is the part of the body that embodies most of our actions and accomplishments, from a special vessel called the washing cup, the kfart. And so we begin with the higher world, contemplating God's relevance in our lives, and the higher soul garment of thought, and we move our way down, we work our way down. These daily spiritual stretches help center us and impress upon us the importance of using our biyah effectively in all our affairs. And so if we can get better at doing these three rituals each morning, and if we're already doing it, if we can be more mindful of it, we give ourselves a better chance at being successful during the day to utilize our thought, speech, and action in productive ways. And so today, we spoke about we introduced the concept of seder, hishtalshelut. We introduced the concept of the order of devolution. We learned about the three worlds, the lowest realms, the lowest step of the world of the order of devolution, and we saw that our lives feature a reflection of these spiritual worlds in our garments, the thought, the speech, and the action. And so before we open for question and answers, I will share just a quick overview of this second half of the class. So I think a 1 minute overview, and then we will move on.
Lesson 1. The Evolution of Ego. 1. The disposition of our internal character need not automatically dictate what occurs in the realm of our thought, speech, and action. We can control our levushim, irrespective of our personality. 2. Our actions should be preceded by proper planning, thought, and consultation, speech. On the other hand, we must make certain to graduate from planning and discussion to engage in concrete action. 3. We can begin each day with a motivational exercise that is a built-in feature of Jewish practice. To first think about the Creator, then verbalize our gratitude toward Him, and then act by ritually preparing our hands. This brief early morning tour through Bia sets the appropriate tone for our entire day.